Welcome to Kevin Scott, who is an ex-alienated kid. He is currently a dad of three beautiful children and a pastor. And I guess the best thing to do, Kevin, is to ask you to quickly introduce yourself, and then I'm going to ask you a whole bunch of questions about your experience. So first of all, who is Kevin now?
Yeah, Kevin is a man who wears a lot of different hats. I think that you said it well. I'm a dad. I'm a husband to my wonderful wife, who I've been married to for over 10 years, and I pastor a church and a school over here in the United States. And as it happens, I'm also a trauma survivor. I'm a survivor of this dynamic that we call parental alienation, and I'm really happy to be able to talk with you today about that.
Fantastic. I'm so glad you're here, Kevin, because I really think this is just so remarkably helpful for parents who are currently in the thick of alienation or maybe even no contact with their kids. And they're wondering what they're wondering what kids are going through. And it will give
Yeah.
great comfort to know that, not so much your experience, but it'll be great comfort to know how you've come out the other end and, it's hopefully all working out well for you. But
Yep.
to give everybody a bit of background, it'd be really helpful just to ask you a few basic questions. So how long, when did this start and how long did it go on for, the alienation?
That's a really good question. And in sort of putting the pieces together over the last year and pulling things out of memory and talking to people who were around back when I was a kid, because I'm 42 now, but it started when I was around two. That's my earliest memory of this kind of alienation dynamic that was happening between my mother and my father. I was alienated from my dad by my mom. And the way that it began was, my mom and my dad had a lot of conflict in their marriage. They weren't married that long,
Hmm.
about 2 years. And when they began to go through the proceedings for divorce, my mom started to do a lot of the kind of gatekeeping stuff. She would keep me away from my dad. And the real tragedy in that is that my dad and I actually had a very, very, very close bond. My earliest memories from childhood are with my dad, and they're all good. My dad was a very, very intentional, very involved father. He was kind of a up and coming real estate house fixer upper type guy
Hmm.
in Kansas City, Missouri. And so his schedule was a lot more free. And so I would even say that for the first 2 years of my life, he did a lot of kind of that primary caretaking because my mom worked more of the typical kind of 9 to 5 job out of an office. And
Yeah,
so he was the one that taught me how to talk, how to walk, how to, he was putting books in my hands when I was 2 years old and, teaching me how to sound things out and things like that.
amazing.
Very smart guy. And so those early memories are really, really good. And then I remember one day just waking up and he wasn't there. That's how I remember it. One day I woke up, he wasn't there, and no one was really explaining to me what was happening. Um, and there's obviously feelings of anxiety and things like that that go along with that. But my earliest memory of actual, like, hardcore kind of parental alienation stuff from my mom. I remember being about 2.5 to 3 years old, and I remember asking her if I could. I wanted to see my dad. I was really sad, and I wanted to see my dad. And I remember her grabbing me and screaming at me and screaming into my face in this very hysterical way and telling me that if I spent time with my dad, my father was going to kidnap me. That's what she told me. She said, "Your father is going to kidnap you and he's going to take you away." She said, "He's going to come in the night and get you. He's going to take you away from me, from your little brother, from your grandparents, from your family, and you will never see any of us again. Now, is that what you want?" And she did it in this very cold, kind of matter of fact way. And I remember as a, 2.5 to 3 year old little guy, I mean, I just lost it. I started crying and screaming, and I said, "No, mommy, I don't want that at all." And when I was really good and worked up, she said, "Okay, well, I'll call and see if I can do something about this." And I remember her getting on the phone with a social worker, and that was really where it began. I think that she was inducing fear in me of my dad, and
Yeah,
then using fear to say, "I think that this boy's father may have done something to him." So that's when it began.
yeah. And how long did the experience go on for?
On and off for years. There were periods of time when there was sort of this cycle that would happen where my mother, from pretty early on in the divorce, was making some pretty wild allegations against my dad. Some pretty wild allegations. She was saying that he was violently abusive, that he was woefully neglectful, that he was an alcoholic, that he was later on, there was this narrative about him being a child molester. And
Hmm.
she was telling me all these things. Like from the time I was very, very, very young, she was telling me these things. And so what would happen is that my dad would have to fight this to prove the other side of it. And so there were court ordered supervised visitations and those kinds of things. And depending on the competency of the supervisor or the caseworker, that would kind of depend on how long the alienation was allowed to go on for. But eventually, we did get a fairly good caseworker and a fairly good supervisee who both spent time with my dad and with me and with my little brother and saw us on visitations and things like that. And finally, the conclusion that they came to was that there's no evidence of these allegations. And so at that point, my dad was allowed to have a lot more freedom in visiting with us. It When I was probably, I would say 5 to 6 years old, that's when it became more of the standard sort of, you're going to get them on the weekends. And eventually that became overnights. And eventually that became like 30 days in the summer and that kind of thing. So
Oh,
that
good.
was kind of how things were going on with my dad.
Mm,
But then there was the home front, and there was what my mom was doing and saying to me through all of that.
mm.
And so through all of that, my mother continued to tell me these stories about my dad that were very, very inconsistent with the person that I knew him to be. I remember some of them very vividly. She told me one of her favorites was telling me about the night that she had finally decided to leave him and that she had picked me up and tried to leave the house with me. And my dad had grabbed a flaming log out of a fireplace and bashed her in the skull with it and held her at gunpoint. And she had ran out of the house with me and vowed never to return to that monster again. That was a favorite of hers. She would tell me that one a lot. She would tell me that they had had house pets, that they had had cats and dogs, and that my dad would get into these violent rages and would actually kill house pets. At a certain point, my mom got like really, really religious, like Pentecostal type religious. And it became, sometimes it would take on like a religious bend. She would tell me that my father was possessed by the devil. She would tell me that if I would go on visitation with my dad and my dad would buy me something, even
Mhm.
something really harmless like an action figure or like army men or things like that, she would take those things away from me and she would say, no, no, you can't have those. That's ungodly. And sometimes she would punish me, sometimes physically, for things that I did while I was with my dad. So if my dad, I remember my dad took us to a lot of movies and theaters. That was one of his favorite things to do with us. And if we went and saw a movie that my mom didn't think was appropriate and she found out about it, we would get punished for that. We would get punished for things that we were doing with our dad. Those kinds of things. Does all that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I'm hoping to go into even more detail in a few minutes. I mean, that's a
Absolutely.
that's a lot for a kid to be taking on board. Um,
Yep.
who were the alienators? Was it just your mum, or was it other people as well?
It was primarily my mom. My mom did remarry when I was about 6.
Mm,
And my stepfather is, it's interesting to talk about him because we've had a very, 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 I would say, complicated relationship.
hmm.
At face value, he's not necessarily a bad guy. He's very, very religious, and he was very easy for my mother to control. That was the main thing.
Yeah.
And my mother would abuse me through him. So he was very gullible. He was very easy to control. And what I now understand, it's pretty obvious that when my mom married him, she was trying to replace my dad.
Yeah.
So she would refer to him from very early on as like, your father is coming home soon.
Mm,
She
yeah.
tried to get me to take on his last name, which
Yeah.
I would sometimes try to do and then not do. There was a lot about, you need to let him adopt you. She tried to pressure me into doing that, and I would never go along with it.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff. So there was a lot of that going on. So again, at face value, he's a flawed individual. Um, my mom died about 5 years ago, but he is still living. And recently, he and I kind of began talking again, and we got some of this kind of out in the open. Not all of it, but some of it. And a lot of it was just that, quite frankly, my mom was just very, very, very controlling and very good at what she did. So he was
Mm.
kind of these days I kind of feel bad for him because he was kind of, I would say she abused him. That's the word that I would use. And then through him, she abused me. So he was the only other really primary alienator, although my mom would rope like people in the church, like the church leadership sometimes would be involved. I remember actually when I reconnected with my dad, he told me this story, and I believe it 100%. When my dad got supervised visitations back, the first places that those began to happen at were actually inside of this like church building where we attended. And my dad came for a visit one day, and he had been out like working on this house. And so before he came in the house, or before he came in the church, he took a bottle of rubbing alcohol and dumped it all over his hands and cleaned his hands with it. And I had seen my dad do that before. So I knew that was just what he did. He carried a bottle of rubbing alcohol, and that was how he cleaned it up. But when he came into the church, the pastor of this church was like, I smell vodka on you. There's no way we're going to allow you to see these kids. And he wouldn't let him see his kids because he was saying, you've been drinking. And so that obviously was being fueled by my mother, who was saying that my
Mm.
father was this monstrous, alcoholic type of an individual, which he's not.
No.
He likes his beer. I would even say there's probably a mild dependency on beer, but nothing that ever affected me in a harmful way. And certainly not a guy out swinging vodka in the car or anything like that. So
Yeah. Yeah. But it's it's interesting how the flying monkeys are kind of recruited into building out the narrative and build
yeah,
the perception for you as a kid. And when did you realize that this is all going on?
it took me until I was 41 to actually figure it out. And
Just a year ago. I mean, this is
it's yeah.
so
And
recent.
so this is hard because you have to kind of think about this from the perspective of a kid, and a lot of people
Mhm.
forget what it's like to be a child. So now as an adult, I'm saying these things, and
Mhm.
we can even have kind of a laugh about it because obviously it sounds ridiculous. It obviously sounds just patentedly ridiculous. But kids don't think that way. When kids are in development, the mind is not fully formed. And so kids look to their parents for meaning. And so if on one side you're having these visitations with your dad and you're having a really good time and you're not seeing him as an abuser at all, you actually love him very, very much and you're very closely bonded to him. But then you're going home and your other parent, who you also love dearly, is telling you these things. And you also have to understand the way that my mother did it. I mean, my mother was a very charismatic person, and she may have been the best manipulator I've ever met in my life. I mean, she was so convincing in how she would do things.
Mm.
And the reality now that I understand is that my mother was mentally ill. She wasn't a monster. She wasn't a horrible person. She was a mentally ill person who had a lot of trauma that she never got help for. And that's how I see her today, and see kind of her legacy in her life. But as you look at it now, it's obviously ridiculous, but kids don't think that way.
No.
So what it does is for me, I listened to a talk on parental alienation one time from a psychologist named Dr. Childress, and he actually gave me some language that really summed up my experience. And he said, if kids are alienated when they're really, really, really young, a
Hmm.
lot of times they don't take on those real haughty, narcissistic behaviors that you see from like older kids that are alienated.
Yeah.
It's almost like they have a phobia of their father or a phobia of their parent. And
Mm.
that's exactly what I was dealing with. I had a fear of my dad, and I didn't know why. It was like
Yeah.
when I was with my dad, it was like there was this really strong desire to bond. And what was interesting is a lot of times if he had us for like the weekend, the first day would be really, really rough. I would be really kind of on edge and tripped out. But then after like 24 hours, I would kind of start to settle down
Mm.
and things would get better. And then when I had to leave him, it hurt every single time. It hurt every single time. And
Yeah.
I didn't know why. I didn't have a why for explaining why I felt this way.
Mm.
And
Mm.
so as a kid, what do? Well, your mom's telling you that your dad's abusive, so you look for things. The expression that I use is that my mom had loaded the cannon. Okay.
Mm. Mhm.
So I would see my dad drink beer and I would go, this must be what she's talking about.
Yeah.
Um, one of where this really kind of it hit the road was when I was about 12. That was really when the worst alienation happened. And what happened there is around that age, my little brother had developed kind of an unhealthy fascination with fire. And so he would get a hold of matches and candles and things like that, and he would burn things.
Yeah.
And my dad had purchased a piece of land that was close to where we lived with our mother and our stepdad to be closer to us. And he was building a house out there.
Mhm.
And my brother got a hold of a candle and set a portion of it on fire. And
Mhm.
when he did that, in that moment, I saw my dad do something that I had never seen him do before. He grabbed my little brother, and with an open hand, I saw him hit him. And now looking back on it, it was weird because I had seen my mother, spank us. I had seen my stepfather do that. But for some reason, when I saw my dad do that, something like went off in my brain, like red alert, red alert, red alert, red alert, like he's
Mm.
going to kill your brother, and he wasn't. I mean, after, at 5 minutes afterwards, it was fine. And my brother was climbing all over him. But in my head, it was like, oh my God, like this is it. Like if I don't say something, it's going to happen again. And so I kind of sat on it and then went home and told my mother that my little brother had been hit. And she she kind of did this thing where she uh, tell me the story again. And so I told her, and she said, that's not the first time that's happened, has it? And I said, no, it's the first time I've seen it. She said, no, 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 tell me the truth. That's happened before, hasn't it? Yeah, mom, it happened before. And was your father drinking when he did this? No, mom, he wasn't. No, that's not true either. I know your dad. He had a problem with this. He used to get really violent when he would drink. He was drinking, wasn't he? Yeah,
Mm.
mom, he was. And he didn't use an open hand. He used a fist, didn't he? Like, actually show me. And she made me like show her, like, make a fist, and she kind of did this for weeks. And finally, when the story was where she wanted it, which by the time I was done with this, it wasn't just like my brother getting hit once. It was me getting hit dozens of times and getting thrown downstairs. And, my dad was this violent monster who was an alcoholic and drinking and driving and all this other stuff. My mom put me in front of a lawyer and I accused my father of child abuse.
Oh,
And that
wow.
broke me. That
Yeah.
absolutely broke me. And
Just because you were put in front of the lawyer, or because you knew the story wasn't true, or
because
which?
I knew the story, yeah. So it's the expression that I like to use is deep, 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 deep down inside, I knew that what I was saying was not true.
Yeah.
And I knew that I was saying things that weren't true, but I didn't know why.
Mm.
I didn't know why. I mean, I was like 12 years old when this happened.
Yeah.
I didn't have a full understanding of it. And at that point, my mom got the courts involved, and I didn't see my dad for about 3 years.
Mm.
And that was when the most severe alienation happened. I mean, my mom would have me like, now you're going to write your thoughts out because this is good for you. And I would write my dad these absolutely hateful letters where I would say things like, I wanted him dead. I would tell him that I was ashamed of his last name. I would tell him that, just really, 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 really awful things. It was really, really, really bad. And when I was about 15, finally, the courts intervened and they ordered family therapy sessions with a court ordered therapist.
Hmm.
And the guy actually still practices. He's in Kansas City. His name's Greg Sisk. And on the other side of this, actually, when I pulled all this out in therapy, I called him up and I hadn't spoken to him since I was 15, 16.
Yeah.
And I said, I don't know if you remember this or not, but this was our situation. Do you remember this? And he said, unfortunately, I don't remember that specific case, but it's because I had 1,000 other cases just like it. And I was using the term brainwashing. That's what I was saying. I was saying my
Mm.
mother brainwashed me into saying these things. And he said, no, 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 no. It's not, Kevin, it's not brainwashing. The term is alienation. And that's what I told the courts, that you had been alienated from your father. That was the first time I heard the term. And that kind of sent me
Wow.
on the rabbit trail of learning as much as I could about it.
Mm.
So that's a very broad
Yeah.
scope of this. If you want to ask about anything specific, I know it's a
Oh,
lot.
I've got lots, I've got a ton of questions.
Yeah, yeah,
So, and thank you for that, Kevin, because that's kind of gives a really good flavor for just kind of what was going on. But there's so much in the detail that I think it's worth exploring.
yeah,
Let's just talk about your mum to begin with, if that's okay.
yeah, absolutely.
I'm with you, and the people who do the alienation are generally speaking, they're traumatized themselves.
Yep,
And I try to help parents to understand that the person who's hurting them is actually hurt and wounded, and this is why they're doing the stuff that they're doing,
yeah,
and that we have to learn compassion for these people, and it helps us with our healing, but
that's
also
right.
it helps us to see these people in a different light instead of these kind of evil monsters that we perceive them as because they're doing us so much trauma. They're creating so much trauma and chaos in our lives to kind of flip it around. So it's very helpful to hear you say, yeah, she had a mental disorder. So what was your mum suffering from, and
Yep.
how
So
where did that come from in her life?
yeah,
How did those
yeah.
dynamics impact you?
So a lot of this involved me working backwards,
Yeah.
and putting pieces together. So I'm actually writing a book about the experience right now, and the opening sentence, the very first sentence in the book is, in the narratives of our lives, there are no heroes and there are no villains. There are just people who do things.
Mm,
And
I like that.
that is my motto for healing, because my mother is not the villain of the story.
Mm,
The worst things that my mother did to me, nobody wakes up one morning and says, I think that what I want to do is I want to psychologically traumatize my kid and I want to commit psychological child abuse and I want to live in a, no one does that. It comes from a place. And so my mother suffered from a few different things.
mhm,
One thing that she had was something called Munchausen's by proxy, or
mhm.
fictitious disorder. So
Just
that was
for
actually,
everybody's benefit, could you just explain what that is?
yeah. So people with Munchausen's believe that either themselves or people around them are very, very, very sick.
Mm,
They're often over medicated and they often put themselves into the role of the caretaker
yeah.
for validation. And my mother did that with me.
Mm,
Sometimes there's like a hair of truth to what they're saying. Like the kid may actually have something, but they make it out to be a lot worse than it is, or they may actually have, some underlying condition, but then they add, things on top of it.
yeah.
And that was actually the main point of conflict that in my parents' marriage. That was really where it started. From very early on when I was born, my mother was convinced that I was very, very, very sick, that I was very, very ill, that I was allergic to all of these molds and spores and things that were in the air. She was convinced that my father's house was unsafe, that I was going to breathe in, toxic fumes and I was going to die, and that I had asthma and all this other stuff. And so she would medicate me, and my father would refuse to do that. And that was actually where the child abuse label first began to be applied to my dad. She would say, because you're not medicating him, you're abusing him. That's where it started. That
Mhm,
was the very,
mhm.
very first way that it came out. And so her two favorite medications were medications that are used for asthma. Albuterol is one, and corticosteroids like prednisone
How
is
was
the
she
other one.
getting these? Was she just going into a
She was a
pharmacy
nurse.
buying
She
this?
was a nurse. Yeah, she was a nurse, and she knew her way around the health field very, very, very well. And so
Okay.
she would. And now, what's interesting about it is that these days I have a daughter that actually does have asthma. So that's given me a point of clarification.
Yeah.
She was diagnosed with it, and her mother and I, we keep an inhaler on hand, but
Hmm.
we don't use it as like a preventative treatment. She'll have a flare up every once in a while, and
Mm.
we'll give it to her, and then she gets better. my mother was using these medications as like preventative treatments. She was saying, okay, you need to have this inhaler. Like, I mean, I remember 6, 7, 8 times a day when I
Wow.
wasn't sick. I wasn't coughing. There was nothing wrong. And then I would go on visitation with my dad. He wouldn't give it to me, and I was fine. And so that was one thing was Munchausen's by proxy. Again, never officially diagnosed, but I wasn't that sick, and she was doing this.
Yeah.
She also had she lied a lot
Mm.
about a lot of different things, and not only things that involved my dad either. I mean, she was a liar. She lied about a lot of things. When she married my stepfather, she had been married twice before my dad, and she hid that from him. And
Mm.
not only did she hide that from him, but she told her immediate family, do not tell him. And they refused to come to the wedding because of that. They did not agree. Now, I didn't find this out until much, much, much later, but you look at all the wedding photos, and none of my mother's immediate family are in there. And that's why.
Yeah.
She told sometimes it would take on really, really, really grandiose stuff. She told me that God had spoken to her directly and had told her that she was so special that she was never going to die. That was a
Mhm.
favorite of hers. She
Yeah.
told me that she could see angels, that she could see demons, that she had special abilities, that she had experienced miraculous healings in her life, that
Hmm.
she had been a spy, that she had worked for the FBI, dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of other things. And then, of course, there's all the stuff with my dad, too. So
Mm.
she, I call it like dark triad type stuff, narcissistic type stuff. She was very, very, very grandiose. You could not tell her that she was wrong.
Hmm.
She was a very, very, very emotionally fragile person.
Yeah.
Um, you couldn't call her out on things, and she really lived in kind of this delusional world of lies that I got sucked up into.
Mm.
Um, Now, what's really interesting about this, and where initially the pattern broke, and this was where I had to do some family history. I had to really do some research on this. My mother's immediate family, oftentimes people that develop this pathology have been abused somewhere along the line.
Yeah.
My mother's immediate family, the family that I grew up with, um, are wonderful. My grandmother, my grandfather, they were two of the most warm, loving people you could ever meet in your life. They were amazing.
Yeah.
All of my aunts and uncles on that side, I'm still on very good terms with. They're very
Good.
loving people. And eventually, what I traced this back to was that my mother was adopted. My mother was
Okay.
adopted, and my mother, in speaking with her adopted family, the family I grew up with, that was really helpful because they began to describe this pattern that emerged really early on in my mother's life, where the lies started with her telling them about like who her father actually was. Like, I know who my dad is, and someday he's going to come back and get me. And she would make up all these really wild stories about him.
Yeah.
Um, and at times she would almost like punish them. She would get real vindictive.
Mhm.
She was kind of the family rebel, and she would really rebel against them for this stuff. And again, this is just me hypothesizing, but when my mother was adopted, her adopted parents, my grandparents, had been told that they would never have children. So they were going to have to adopt. And they adopted my mom. They got her when she wasn't like a newborn, but it was under 1 year old. In pictures that I've seen, my guess would be somewhere between 4 and 6 months old, somewhere in there
Yeah.
was when
Very
they
young.
got her.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was when they got her. But less than a year or about a year after they adopted her, lo and behold, they had their first kid naturally. And then lo and behold, then they had another one, and then another one, and then another one. They had four natural kids.
Wow.
And that's where understanding this whole attachment system thing is really, really helpful because you can't fight biology.
Yeah.
And a mother is going to bond with a kid that comes out of her body in a way that they're not going to bond with an adopted kid
I was just going
through
to ask
no
if
through no
yeah.
fault of theirs. It's not
Yeah.
their fault. But my belief is that from a very early age, my mother sensed that. And
Mm.
from that, she developed this insecurity, which led to her I need to be the center of attention. I need to be special. I need to be the
Yeah.
special one. And instead of coming back to that point of insecurity, she just built all of these lies on top of it.
Mm.
And ultimately, it became kind of this pathology in her. So